Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/securityweekly.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. This is the news for the week of the 16th.
That was really punny.
Apparently, I have been missing some good puns in studio while I was away. Where do you? I mean, do you guys need a minute to recover?
Yes.
Is everything okay? Cool.
Oh, this is going to be so mad because it's something that we cannot repeat on air.
Perfect. So I will be continuing to, be left in the dark while everyone laughs. It's okay. It's quite all right. I look forward to this. So let's dive right into it with global warming's impacts on cloud computing. So story number 3, under bugs, breaches, and more. I thought it was interesting this week because Microsoft Azure in their Southwest region a couple of weeks ago had an outage. Which I believe was reported as something due to like a lightning strike or some sort of major event that caused outages to power in the region. And ultimately, what ended up happening, or the reason for the shutdown in the data center, was the data center was just too hot. The cooling stopped working, and so it shut everything down rather than have damage to the servers themselves. Now, this is the second time that this has happened this year for Microsoft. They had one happen earlier this year in Dublin. And so, yeah, I mean,
was it the same thing? Because it sounds like an architecture problem in their data centers that the servers stay running and their backup generators are working awesome, but when they lose power, there's some event, the cooling systems don't have the proper backups. Which I could see, because if you've ever seen cooling systems for a data center, they're massive. And you can imagine what it must take to power the cooling system off of a generator.
Of course, the generator puts off its own amount of heat, so you making sure that that's away from...
Right. Yeah. It does sound like an data center architecture issue.
Potentially.
Well, I mean, there's also, for me, the way I'm looking at this is I think we're going to see more of this more often, even if it's, cooling systems are able to keep up with how many people are moving to the cloud these days, and just with how hot certain regions of the world seem to be getting, the Southwest being one of them. I mean, they've had record-breaking heat all summer, and as well, by the way, in Dublin. So parts of London and in Europe, Great Britain, etc., have had record-breaking temperatures all season yet again. And so it makes me wonder if at some point we reach this kind of critical mass of so many systems running so hot inside of data centers, and it's just so hot outside that you can't actually off-put the temperature successfully. So,
well, yeah, because everyone's dumped their physical iron and put it up all in the cloud. So, like, not everyone, but most people's servers now aren't in there. They're in someone else's data center, and they're all in the same similar data centers.
But isn't part of that problem the fact that we're trying to stick all of these, like, computers in so tight, trying to maximize space, and they should be able, the manufacturers should be able to make heat sinks and fans and things that can actually keep their stuff cool when there's other heat around. It shouldn't be entirely on the data center.
It is.
No, that's true.
I mean, even if our small server closet that we have, and I even use the term closet loosely, there's an air conditioning unit in there and a sensor that sends my phone an alert if the temperature gets over like 78 degrees.
You have like a Nest in there.
No, it's a SmartThings. It's a SmartThings sensor actually. That monitors it, because it's amazing if the air conditioning, even if that one unit can't keep up, if the air conditioning goes off in the rest of the building, that one unit can't can't keep up.
It seems like in certain parts of the world you could use more space for the data center and then have better cooling by actually having space in between the servers instead of 1U, 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 or whatever you're doing. And then you can have airflow.
Or liquid cooling too. We were talking earlier about Microsoft under CE, it's like the under the sea dance.
Under the sea, yes.
It's like the under the sea dance, except it's the under the sea data center.
Well, and so they actually, we talked about that. Gosh, I feel like it was a month or two ago on the show. It might have been Pulse Security Weekly. I don't recall exactly which one, but yeah, I mean, literally, it was something that they were launching, I think, off of the British Isles, that had some sort of like power generation or battery power that was generated based on like the waves, right? So like the motion of the ocean, in this case, literally, was what was actually charging the data center to some degree. Not to mention, of course, cooling as well, right? Because it was literally water cooled by being submerged.
And sharks with freaking laser beams.
I know, right? Like now you've got a whole different set of threats. The
physical
Russians.
Security to the max.
It's that their physical security. It's sharks with laser beams.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Imagine
so how
doing
do you
a pen
monitor
test.
that, right?
You got to do a pen test.
Do you have like cameras on the outside? Like.
You have sharks with cameras.
Sure. I mean, that is one of those situations where it's like, eventually, is the surface of the Earth going to get too hot to run data centers in areas that don't cost too much from a space location? So, for example, trying to put it in San Francisco just wouldn't happen because rent is too high, right? So. It ends up being kind of this weird conundrum because April, to your point, and Paul, to yours as well, from an architecture standpoint, the reason they're doing the 1U, 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 1U all the way up the stack is because they actually want to maximize profits for the space is ultimately what it gets back to, right? And so it's going to be hard to convince them to say, put less computing power in your data center so that it can be more easily cooled, because that actually has a direct hit on potential profits, which, again, a lot of companies, Microsoft, Google, especially Amazon, are all leaning very heavily into the cloud space from a profit standpoint because it's, easy money for them, I guess, at this point.
It's
so
a direct hit to when your data center goes down. So it's a risk-based
it's a risk
decision,
either way, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But,
and not to mention just good failover processes, right? Like that would have helped a lot.
And if we look at, let's say, people are looking at the future of farming, for example, and they're looking at vertical farming. So they're going to run into the same problems, but they're using LEDs. They're using things that are more efficient. And we are not doing that with our servers and our routers and our other things. We're not looking at more efficient servers. We're looking at faster and able to have more. So if we were doing more vertical data centers versus it takes up 4 acres flat and it's one level, which is what a lot of data centers that I've seen are. If we're doing more vertical and we can have heat rising and use the and use, I don't know, all kinds of different things like digging into the earth to try to get, well, I guess that's heat, but trying to use like the forces of nature for our own good, where we have the cooling coming from, I don't know. I'm just babbling.
So in my mind, I like the idea of the vertical data center, but maybe doing it down into the earth as opposed to up into the air, right? So now you literally have the cooling all takes place at ground level.
Just don't go too deep because then it gets hotter.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So
not necessarily. I mean, down to certain depths,
Keith, you just started Cyloning. We call that Cyloning.
Oh, well.
Yeah, when you talk, you sound like a Cylon. You just gotta unplug your microphone and plug it back in, or your USB device.
So you could have like thermal power, like hydrothermal power or thermal power or something coming out of the ground. And then, that's the word I was looking for. So you have thermal power coming out of the ground. You have heat rising to the top of a building and coming out, almost like a cooling tower, maybe, like with, I'm just speculating at this point, but, some kind of cooling tower where the heat rises and goes away from everything. And then
dude,
you
like
have
a
airflow.
year from now, you're going to read an article and someone's going to implement your exact design. You're going to be like, God damn it, they were listening to the show.
It's going to be like an old nuclear facility or something.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Oh, you're still silent.
1 second.
That's awesome. I have not used Alpine Linux either. It kind of sounds like a Docker version of CoreOS. Is that? I know, Keith, you're working on your audio stuff. I'm just trying to continue with the stories.
It sounds like the next version of macOS, like Alpine.
Alpine?
Yeah.
Has there been an Alpine?
No.
No, there hasn't, right? Remote code execution flaw in Alpine Linux, a distro that pops up a lot in Docker containers.
So Alpine it's not CoreOS. It's, what's the right word?
Is it similar?
Alpine is used more because it is more minified than your Ubuntu's, than your Debians.
I like it already.
Now, it's right, which is why it's good for Docker containers.
Yeah.
Now, the other side of it though is this, right? So it's not your Gentoo's or your Arch Linux either, right? It's not so
like it
minified
even more
that
now.
it's ridiculously minified.
Talk about holy wars.
But the problem here is this, right? So it's used in a lot of containers because of the fact that it's so small, so thin. And so this particular issue that was brought forward, so that you're talking about bugs, breaches, and more, story number 1,
Yes.
was basically a researcher who started their own crowdsourced security bug bounty program or company, Max Justix, found a remote code execution flaw. And so, as we all know, remote code execution is pretty bad. And ultimately what it was is you'd have to be able to play man in the middle to the APK process, which is similar to like the apt-get or to the yum install process for Alpine. And so if you got man in the middle traffic there, you could effectively leverage arbitrary code execution of the APK as it's installing on the device to then get remote code execution and, maybe persist or do any number of other things. What was interesting about that is in the article, Justix told, in this case, the story was in the register, in the default configuration of Alpine, if I can man in the middle of the traffic going to the machine that is running the APK command, I can make that machine execute the arbitrary code. And I can also allow the Docker container build process or command to succeed even after my malicious code ran. So basically it's like he can now sit in the middle of that traffic. And I think there was another one in here that he said something about Alpine specifically, how it has problems with potential man in the middle traffic. But in the end of the day, in my mind, man in the middle is not hard per se, depending on the package that's being installed, where it lives, where it's, if you're adding other repositories, that are maybe third-party repositories to pull down additional APKs for installed software, could easily get some sort of man in the middle there. So yeah, this was not great. And by the way, most of the packages handled by APK are not served via TLS. So tampering is actually somewhat trivial there.
And it depends on what your threat model is too. So if your threat model is nation state or something like that, then you could easily get on a cellular network or something like that and be able to serve things to people that are not connecting. We don't even have like VPNs to our app stores, so I don't know how we could possibly, unless we're doing CRC checks on the things that we're downloading, and who really does that on mobile?
I think you're right. I think largely it's left to the end user, because there's been a lot of attacks on Android that I've seen, especially like you can just slip other APKs into the APK to execute attacks and all that stuff. So yeah, I don't think that's being done.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it sounds like they need to start getting a lot of these packages verified, maybe with some code signing, get them behind, secure connections so that man in the middle isn't made possible. Otherwise, I could definitely see this being something that we start to see pop up. I don't know, give it 6 months, probably less, where companies are breached as a result of, poisoned containers via APK commands. I mean, earlier this year, Paul, we've seen a number of attacks that were takeovers of GitHub repositories or NPM repositories or any number of other things related to, just code storage, right? So I'm not going to be surprised at all when somebody has, a breach of a large magnitude because they had a poisoned Docker container because they were using Alpine Linux as their base for their Docker image.
So when you're connected to your the Wi-Fi Pineapple fake Starbucks network and you're updating your Docker container, be careful. Is that the moral
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
story?
That's a great threat model, and hey,
Yeah.
it's applicable to probably some of our audience. I mean, heck, even if you're at a conference and you're looking at building a container, that container could probably be modified over the air because you're connecting to the conference Wi-Fi. And by the way, like fake conference Wi-Fi, especially at a security conference, is a very real thing. So
At any conference, anywhere. I mean, just don't trust Wi-Fi. Yeah.
Yes, pretty much. Yeah, Wi-Fi. Use a VPN always, all the time. I mean, I know that I do.
Even on cellular.
I mean, yeah, I'm using one right now when I'm talking to Paul. I can't trust his connection, so.
I wouldn't.
You don't know where it's been.
Exactly. Exactly. April. I mean, he's got almost every episode recorded of all of his shows, so yeah, maybe, I don't know. With that, one other one that I wanted to make sure we talked about was that the Flawed Safari Ios. So this was interesting because it's literally cascading style sheets. There is some proof of concept code out there. I don't know that Apple has pushed this, but if you effectively just include a little bit of this this style sheet like information, and as you look at it, it looks like it's just really long base64 encoded string. The Safari browser on iOS can't read it, and so it will literally remote restart your iOS device. So yeah, not great. Basically, looking at base64 base images potentially in background on repeat causes iOS to crash.
That's an interesting implementation of fail securely.
Right?
Right. So it's like just maybe don't render or don't think about rendering or don't allow that style process.
Yeah,
I don't
some
know.
kind of pop-up like something's wrong. Don't visit the site, malicious site, something. Yeah.
Well, right, exactly. So the other thing that this tells you, by the way, is if you're putting your gray hat, your white hat, your black hat on, and you're thinking, okay, I know that Safari, based on cascading style sheet rendering, crashes the entire operating system of iOS. How deeply connected is Safari to iOS, right? So
and it's obviously missing some kind of bounds checking in there to catch some of these exceptions, right? I mean, right. I don't know. It's not like a traditional variable where you're just trying to stuff more than you should into a variable. The rendering engine it works differently, I would imagine, but there's definitely some kind of lack of bounds checking.
Yeah, that is going to be a bug that comes back and either has really bad ramifications or gets reported to Apple, who I believe is now paying for iOS bugs as part of their bug bounty more openly, at least, than they used to be. So who knows? Maybe someone will make some serious cheddar off this.
I wonder if that's signature-based or behavioral-based that they're detecting, where it reboots.
That is a good question. Honestly, it doesn't go into
like
it.
What's
and I have about
Interesting.
Because if it's behavioral based, then there's probably other things that you could do. If it's signature based, then that means that somebody created this.
Right. Well, and
right.
I mean, we're going to use our mobile phones to vote, so this could definitely be used to disrupt an election because you just send everyone a link that crashes their phone and then they can't vote. So
it's a good thing I don't have multiple phones. Vote early, vote often.
I know, right? Well, that's the other thing. I didn't even want to get into that, but we can totally go there. Yes. So story number one, if you build it, they will come. It is actually a little bit of an older story. I think it came back maybe late last month, earlier this month, but I wanted to circle back on it because the state of West Virginia Secretary of State Mac Warner has said that they're going to go ahead and use a blockchain technology with a recorded public digital ledger to allow for ballots to be cast by individuals that are overseas in the armed forces in this midterm election.
But now let's think about that. That actually is an interesting use case for blockchain and not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, of course, it depends on how the system is implemented. Mobile phones make it a little scary for me. But if you think about what the blockchain is, it is very much a public ledger whose purpose is to preserve transactions. Voting systems could benefit from that. I think there's a lot of work to be done to test that to make sure and do the threat modeling would be an interesting exercise. But that It's also been talked about that they are using blockchain for supply chain management, where you have to maintain a record of where all of your stuff is moving from and to.
It preserves the integrity of the votes. It does not defend against affecting anything before the vote is cast. So, like we saw at DEF CON with the voting machine hacking village. If it gets into the blockchain, then it's in the blockchain, and it gets counted regardless of what happens to the machine or how the votes get into the blockchain. So, yeah, it's a great way to keep integrity of the votes once they're cast, but before they're cast, that's still the problem.
Yeah, it's a client-server model, and here the problem is the client, right? You can't determine that the phone wasn't owned. You can't determine that the individual who actually, is doing the vote was in fact the same person that registered to do the vote via this system, right? Because basically what they had you do is you take a picture of your face and a picture of like your state-issued ID, whether that's like your passport or your military ID or what have you.
That's controversial by itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. And so the other part of it is this, right? They had you take a picture of a 2D image, and then they had you take a selfie, and then they were comparing the outcome of your selfie to your 2D image, which means that they're effectively rendering your face that is the supposed to be the 3D representation into a 2D space, meaning you could easily, in my mind, you could pretty easily fake that, right? Like, you're not even looking for 3D actual rendering on like the Face ID of, say, like a new iPhone. You're just looking at a comparison of, the structure of the face, which you could easily spoof. So I don't know. I have a lot of questions here. I agree with April, your assessment that the integrity of the vote, once it has been cast, sure, blockchain makes a little bit of sense here, even though it's like the biggest buzzword since sliced bread. But at the same time, if you're using an Android device that's on like, I don't know, Android 4, and could be remotely rooted, trivially, and someone is just, in an area of the world that's, by the way, not inside of the United States. It's probably pretty close to the borders or within the borders of nations and peoples that don't really like us all that much. There will be active, measures that people will take to try and mess with this. I guarantee it.
Like, how do you prevent people like Netflix does from connecting with a VPN?
Yeah,
and saying that you're in the U.S.
It's an identity partly identity problem as well.
Yeah, there are any number of issues that I see with this. It's only going to be used, I guess, by service men and women overseas for this first kind of trial run. And although a number of people have come forward and saying you should not do this, we cannot guarantee the security of this application that you're using. Although.
Sounds great.
Yeah, basically, they cite in the article too, right? They say quite literally, Joseph Lorenzo Hall, the chief technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology, says mobile voting is a horrific idea. And then they go on to say something to the effect later, whereas basically they had, here we go. They say quite literally, a senior Department of Homeland Security official says that, in their efforts to secure the state's voting infrastructure, it has earned praise from Matthew Masterson, that senior Department of Homeland Security official. Congratulations. I know that the government, especially Department of Homeland Security, is supposed to be good at security. All I have to cite here is OPM, and I will leave it at that when it comes to their ability to secure infrastructure. So yeah, the bar is pretty low. If they're impressed with this, I can tell you I'm not, and I haven't even looked at it for 10 minutes.
Well, it sounds like they mentioned the praise, but not the criticism, maybe? Like, this is good for this, but blah, blah, blah. We'll just talk about this.
Right. It's like, okay, what did you do to assess it? Where is your, assessment report? What sort of flaws were found? Did you do any sort of assessment report? Who did you use to do an assessment? Was it the NSA, or was it Bob's pen testing from the puppy mill down the street that, we all seem to really hate because they're running, no offense to the fine folks at Tenable, but they're running older versions of Nessus, and that's all they're doing, and then spitting out a report. Whereas, by the way, if they were using maybe Tenable.io, I'd be a little bit more trustworthy. So I don't know. I don't like this at all anywhere, and that it's being used frightens me terrifically. What do you guys want to talk about next? Breaches and stock prices, not sock prices.
I was hoping it was data breaches affect SOC performance in the long run, because there's a lot of different directions we could have taken.
Prevents holes.
That's right.
Loss.
April is owning that topic. Her new talk at DerbyCon is going to be about SOC security, and it's all just going to be slide after slide of puns.
Well, so the thing is, I could totally see that working for like security operations center too, right? Like it could go both ways here.
That's what we're saying, yeah.
So this was interesting because it was actually a retrospective though. So this is going to be story number 2 under If You Build It, They Will Come, and it's a retrospective on stock performance of companies, 28 companies in particular that may have had a major breach sometime over like the last 10 years. And what they found is after a year, where a major breach is announced, share price grew by 8.53% on average, but it underperformed the NASDAQ by something like 3.7%. Whereas after 2 years, average share price rose to 17.78% of, say, day of breach, but underperformed the NASDAQ by an additional 11.35%. So it would have been closer to like 30% growth as opposed to 17%.
You can't look at that data and conclusively say that data breaches affect the stock performance in any direction, because there's just too many variables to a stock price. Well, I mean, as I learn more about stocks and own some of my own stocks now and paying more attention to it, there's so many factors that you can't, even from that smaller sampling where, I mean, the majority, a lot of them are retailers as well. So if retail in general was down on the NASDAQ for a certain period of time, that could contribute more to your data than one event in each of those companies. That also, by the way, happened at very different times. So I poo-poo this article wholeheartedly on the fact that you can make data say whatever you want and put it on the internet and people believe it.
So I've seen a lot of data that shows that after a breach, the stock price dips and then it goes back up, eventually higher than it was before the breach. If we were an extremely security conscious populace and all of the consumers cared about their data and didn't forget about what happened 2, 3, 5 years ago, like Target, for example, or something like that, then we would not see it go from here down and then back up. We would see it go from here and down, and the company would go out of business because we'd be like, they are not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right, but don't forget that a breach can impact not just consumers, but other relationships as well that could impact the business even more significantly. And I don't think we're seeing that.
Supply chain.
Yeah, it's supply chain. But what if Target, for example, right, it's going, well, next year we're going to add 100 stores, and they added 112 because none of that aspect of the business was impacted by the breach. Well, now, of course your number's going to be up. Sorry, Keith, go ahead.
Putting on my statistician hat for a moment, and I agree, Paul, there are 3 kinds of lies, which is lies, damned lies, and statistics.
Yep.
The thing that stands out to me are kind of a few things, right? So in total, the listed companies, which was 28 companies, including Apple, Adobe, Anthem, Community Health Systems, Dun & Bradstreet, eBay, Equifax, Experian, Global Payments, on and on, right? The point that I think is important here is, though they are in similar industries and sectors, they aren't all in the same sector necessarily, right? So TJ Maxx is not in the same sector as T-Mobile, or Under Armour is not in the same sector as Adobe, right? So there is variance there that I think is significant to point out. The other side of it, though, is that all of the analyzed breached companies, all of them, had poor performance that cannot be ignored as compared to the NASDAQ over a period of time, right? That is an outlier, because if it was the case that, okay, sure, they all have a dip and then they all come back, as April is pointing out, which does happen, right? You'd have maybe a handful of them, or maybe half of them, that continue to have poor performance against the NASDAQ comparatively post-breach. The fact that all of them have negative impacts compared to the NASDAQ post-breach is significant. Especially for a sample size of 28, which is also considered statistically significant because it is also a varied sample with a lot of different companies. Sure, many of them are tech companies, but not all of them. In fact, a number of them aren't tech companies. So I don't know. I think that there's some merit to what's being shared here. Yes, I am, of course, always a little bit leery of such things, especially when it comes to stock performance and statistics. But here, I thought it was interesting, right? Because it felt like it was at least a decently well done, article and study, as opposed to your traditional, hey, we're going to send out an email and have everybody vote on a survey, right? So, I don't know. Any final thoughts there?
No. I think that at least with some of those companies, you're dealing with brand loyalty too, especially let's say Apple, and T-Mobile as well.
Nike.
I mean, they have.
No. I was just throwing that out there to see if anyone would know. Okay.
Nope.
Fine.
So like Apple, for example, they're always going to have certain brand loyalty in a certain area. There are a lot of competitors that are trying to surpass them. They've also had their share of losses and personal impact, let's say, over the past 10 years, where I don't know. It's hard to quantify. I mean, as you add them all together and average them, if they're all below NASDAQ, then yes, that is significant. Would they be below NASDAQ anyway? Were they before? Where's the comparison of where they were to NASDAQ before the breach? And also, do consumers assume that after a breach, a company is going to fix their problems? So after a breach, let's say we'll talk about Target as the ubiquitous example. Are they going to fix their supply chain problems? Are consumers going to assume they were breached? It cost them money. Their stock dropped. All these things happened, and then now they're better. Like it's like you get like cancer removed or something. Like now you're better. Like is that what people think of the companies, or are they? I think
we as InfoSec people certainly think that, because my wife and family and friends will ask me like, "Oh, this place just got breached. Like, should I shop there?" I'm like, "Well, if you used your credit card there, like someone already has it, so that ship has sailed." I'm like, secondly, it's probably the more secure store to shop in right now post breach, because they're really paying attention to security because they just got breached.
And they brought in third parties to look at different things, and but does that affect the long term, and how does it compare to before? So there's no comparison in terms of that particular statistic involving the NASDAQ.
In the article, you're right. I mean, if it doesn't actually point to the trending that they were on if they had not been breached. And I think you probably could reasonably, go back if any of our listeners happen to, watch stocks and have software to do this, you probably could go back and project those things and show, gaps, right? The article, they don't. So you bring up a good point. That would be really interesting as a follow-on to see as well. Were there any additional, articles in here that you guys saw that you wanted to talk about before we hopped off? I did want to make sure we touched on this week's CommitStrip. But
one last thing, I haven't seen any VoIP pen testing frameworks in quite some time, and there used to be a podcast that I think was called Bluebox Security Podcast, something like that. And this one's called Bluebox-ng. It's a Node.js VoIP penetration testing framework. I hadn't seen much happen in the VoIP space and security and pen testing in a while. Maybe I'm just not looking in the right places, but I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so it's learning and tools number 2. So that was actually, I saw this and I was like, whoa, yeah, I haven't seen anything in the VoIP space either for some time. But here we had someone built, as you said, Bluebox-ng, which is a Node.js framework, includes auto VoIP, UC pen testing, report generation, performance, RFC compliance, SIP TLS and IPv6 support, SIP over WebSockets, and support for RFC 711 or 7118. Shodan, so it also has some Shodan stuff in there. SIP SQLi checks, SIP torture or RFC 4475 for partial support. Geolocation, command completion, cross-platform support, automatic vulnerability searching, including CVE, OSVDB, and NVD, automatic exploit searching for exploit-DB, packet storm, and Metasploit, dumb fuzzing. I mean, this thing looks like it's got a lot of goodness to it. I haven't played with it yet because I really don't have any VoIP, stuff to go play with here, but man, I mean, Node.js coming out swinging with this one. So I thought that this was kind of cool.
Awesome.
Have you guys talked at all on any of your shows about the Tesla, and I talk about like defensive security and preventative security and social engineering, but have you talked at all about the Tesla copying of the key?
Yeah, we covered that on Security Weekly last week.
Good, because that just blew me. I was just like, really? Like,
yeah, key space problems, and
Yeah,
that
you
was
need to
just
get
like,
your firmware updated on your car and get a new key fob if it was manufactured before June of this year, I believe.
Eventually, we'll have two-factor on our cars.
your fingerprint and your fob.
That's right.
Or your face print or whatever it is, yeah.
The window is grabbing your face as you're walking up to...
Or
Don't
the
even
way
get
you
started
sit
there.
in the chair.
Yeah, it
True,
could be.
yeah,
It
it
could
could
be
like
like
a print of your bottom.
Yeah. How it cradles you. Yeah.
It's actually a pretty. It's a good idea until someone else has to borrow your car for something.
Yeah.
You just add other people. Just be like, go sit in the front seat for a minute. I'll add you to my car.
Yeah. You could put it in like valet mode.
Yeah.
Oh man.
I think it would.
Yeah.
There you go.
It depends how often you drive. But
Yeah. It would have to track changes in your butt over time. That sounded really like. It
This is
sounded.
an
Didn't sound that bad in my head when I verbalized it. I was like, "Wow, that sounds horrible."
RFC.
Yes.
You get on that.
So I would actually call it, Paul. I would call it the butt authentication mechanism, or BAM.
Yeah, that's right. The BAM.
Now that we've completely gone off the rails, I want to point all of our listeners
I
to
think April
Story number 3.
should come back every week because I laughed hysterically during the show.
Yeah, I agree. By the way, speaking of more laughter, story number 3 under food for thought is it's not an app from CommitStrip. So
CommitStrip's awesome.
with that, April, thanks for joining us on the show. It was great having you here. Glad that you get to join us and have a bit of laughs with Paul in studio. And for everyone else, thank you for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git commit and stay classy.